I come in the joy and light of thy home. Jesus, I come to thee out of the depths of ruin untold into the peace of thy sheltering fold. Ever thy glorious face to behold. Jesus, I come to thee. Be seated. We turn to 1 Corinthians chapter 15. 1 Corinthians 15. Beginning at the first verse. Now I would remind you, brothers and sisters, of the good news that I proclaimed to you, which you in turn received, in which you also stand, through which was also the power of which you are being saved. If you will only hold firmly to the message that I proclaimed to you, for I handed on to you as of first importance what I in turn had received, that Christ died for our sins in accordance with Scriptures, and that he was buried, and that he was raised on the third day in accordance with the Scriptures, and that he appeared to Cephas, then to the 12. Then he appeared to more than 500 brothers and sisters at one time, most of whom are still alive, even though some of them have died. Then he appeared to James, then to all of the apostles. Last of all, as to one untimely born, he also appeared to me. For I am the least of the apostles, unfit to be called an apostle, because I persecuted the church of God. But by the grace of God, I am what I am, and his grace toward me has not been in vain. On the contrary, I worked harder than any of them, though it was not I, but the grace of God that was in me. Whether then it was I or they, so we proclaim, and so you have come to believe. This is the word of God for the people of God. Thanks be to God. I don't know how many times I've read this passage of Scripture. It's Paul's resurrection chapter. I've heard many sermons on it. I preached 3 sermons on it. I've taught it in Sunday school. I have read it. I have studied it. And for some reason, one verse in there I had overlooked every time I had read it and every time I had studied it. But once I found it, that's all I can see in this whole chapter. And it just stands out to me. Let me set the scene for you. Paul is talking about the resurrection because there were some folks in the Corinthian church that, they had some questions about the resurrection. So Paul is trying to address their concerns, trying to address their questions. He reminds them in this passage of the earliest Christian creed. If anybody ever asks you what's the earliest Christian creed, it's found right here. Christ died, Christ was buried, and Christ arose. That is the earliest Christian creed. And Paul reminds them, Jesus died, Jesus was buried, and Jesus rose. Jesus appeared to all kinds of the other disciples, the other apostles. And then Paul does something a little bit unusual for Paul. He gets very personal. And it seems like he's struggling a little bit here to me, probably because of his past. But he talks about how Jesus even appeared to him. And I think as Paul is writing this letter, as he's thinking about the questions these Corinthians have, Paul is also looking back at his life. And even though he would never come out and say it, I think Paul had some questions too. Because I think Paul was astounded and amazed at what God had done in his life. And then here comes the verse that I had overlooked all of these years. Paul says, by the grace of God, I am what I am. And his grace toward me has not been in vain. On the contrary, I worked harder than any of them, though it was not I, but it was the grace of God. You know, up to this point, up to chapter 15 in 1 Corinthians, Paul used the word grace 3 times. And then in chapter 15, Paul uses the word grace 3 more times. So when he uses the same word right there in one verse, the same amount of times as he's used it in 15 chapters, I think that requires our attention. What is grace? Grace is something that's tough to define. I've heard grace be defined as unmerited favor, but when I hear a definition like that, it kind of makes me want to have to go and look up some of those words too, so I'm not sure that helps a lot. I have used it before as a coin. Grace on one side and mercy on the other side. Mercy being God not giving us what we do deserve, and grace being God giving us what we don't deserve. I have heard people take the word grace, the G-R-A-C-E, and talk about God's riches at Christ's expense. All of those are good, but I don't think any of them really adequately define the word grace. What is it? Grace is a love for people at their best and at their worst. Grace is a love which gives people what they need, not what they deserve. Grace is this magical, and maybe magical is not a good word, but this amazing combination of forgiveness and hope. And when Paul looks at his life, Paul sees God's grace in action. After all, Paul was the one who was standing there when the first Christian martyr was killed. Who was the first Christian martyr? Stephen. Stephen was stoned for nothing other than being an on-fire Christian. And while Paul wasn't actually doing the stoning, remember what Paul was doing? He was holding the coats of those who were doing the stoning. Paul tried his best to stamp out Christianity. And then one day he's on his way to Damascus. Remember the story? Paul sees this bright light. Paul hears this voice. And it is the voice of Jesus. From that moment on, Paul's life was different. From that moment on, Paul's life was changed. At that moment on that Damascus road, God had appeared to Paul, and God had given Paul a brand new future. Paul had been forgiven, Paul had been given hope, and Paul had been given a second chance. And now Paul would start living by the golden rule instead of the law. Now Paul would realize that people were more important than regulations. Now Paul would understand that humility was more important than boastful pride. That knowing Christ, that knowing Jesus, that falling in love with Jesus was more important than being known. That compassion was more important than a judgmental spirit. That serving others was more important than being served. And that righteousness was more important than ritual. Paul was a changed man. And Paul, as he's writing this letter, attributes this change to the grace of God. And I think as Paul looked back over his life, as Paul began to think about everything God had done for him, I think what happened to Paul was that he realized that grace had done in his life 6 things. And the good news is that grace will do that exact same thing in your life and in my life. What can we learn about grace today? First of all, grace is enough to save any sinner. If it was not enough, then every one of us would be lost. We think about everything Paul had done. And yes, Paul was doing it in the name of God, but God was not approving of it. But then when God spoke to Paul, Paul was changed and Paul was saved. In fact, Paul would write to the Ephesians in chapter 2 that it is by grace we are saved. And the grace of God will reach everyone. Jesus said, if you'll come to me, I will not cast you out. Grace was enough for Paul. Grace was enough for that IRS agent Zacchaeus. It was enough for the woman found in adultery. It was enough for Peter who had fallen. It was enough for that jailer in Philippi. And grace is enough for you, and grace is enough for me. Somehow, and I don't understand it, and I can't explain it. I wish I could grasp it, but I can't. But somehow, when Jesus died on the cross, God took that payment and applied it to you and applied it to me. For you see, Jesus was innocent. Jesus had done nothing to deserve death. And yet they killed Jesus. Jesus had no sin. The Bible says the wages of sin is death. But Jesus didn't have any sin to pay for. So when Jesus died on the cross, what was Jesus paying for? He was paying for your sin. And he was paying for my sin. And somehow, in some transaction, some way, and I don't understand it, but I do thank God for it, God will take that grace and God will apply it to you and to me. Grace is enough to save every sinner. But not only that, grace is enough to keep all that ever were saved, saved. The book of Jude has a great verse in it. Jude chapter 1 verse 24. It says, "Now unto him that is able to keep you from falling and to present you faultless before the presence of his glory with exceeding joy." That verse has an amazing message. It says that there is one who is able to keep us from falling. What does that mean? That means we have eternal security. That means the same grace that saved us, the same grace that we did not deserve in the first place, is going to be the same grace that will keep us saved. When you became a Christian, when you were saved by grace, you were not saved because of your performance. You were not saved because of your actions. You were saved because of what Jesus did on the cross. That was enough to save you. So why do some people think that if they were saved by grace, if they were saved not based on their performance, that somehow their performance is going to keep them saved? If it wasn't good enough to save you, it's not going to be good enough to keep you saved. If you couldn't be good enough to get saved, you can never be good enough to stay saved. But God doesn't expect your performance to save you. God saves you by grace, and it's that same grace that saves you that will keep you saved. You didn't deserve to be saved, and you don't deserve to continue to be saved. That's why it's called grace. That's why it's called grace. And Paul realizes that even though he couldn't save himself, God's grace could. And even though he couldn't keep himself saved, that God's grace can. And God's grace will. Grace is enough to save any sinner. Grace is enough to keep every sinner that was saved, saved. And grace is enough to lift up anyone who has fallen. When we think about the story of the prodigal son, I think that story illustrates grace and in a powerful, powerful way. The prodigal son was born into that family. What did the prodigal son deserve? What had he done? What action did he do to deserve to be born in that family? He had nothing to do with it. He didn't ask to be born. He didn't ask to be born into that family. He didn't deserve to be born into that family. It was simply by grace. So the prodigal son was a son by grace. And even when he went to his father and said, "I want what's coming to me. I want my share of the inheritance, and I'm going to go off and live my life by myself." Even when he did that, even when he was in the far country, you know what? He was still the prodigal son. He was born into that family. He didn't deserve it. It was grace. And even though his actions were despicable, even though his actions hurt the heart of his father, even though he was far off from his father, he was still a son. He was born a son. He was a son at home. Even when he was looking at the food the pigs were eating and was wondering if he might could just get a bite of that, he was still a son. That never changed. He was born that way by nothing that he had ever deserved, nothing he had done. He was kept that way even though his performance wasn't good. And then came the day when this son This one who at one time had the best clothes. This one who at one time had the best food. This one who was living with the Father at one time came to his senses, and he realized that the life he was living wasn't worth continuing to live. And he says to himself, how far have I fallen? And he decides to go home. Can you imagine what he looked like, what he smelled like when he went home? He certainly didn't look like the son that father had known. But he still was a son. His performance surely wasn't a performance that pleased his father, but he still was a son. He didn't look like his son, he didn't smell like his son, but he still was his son. And when the father sees his son, he runs. He throws his arms around him. He says, I want you to get the robe. I want you to get the shoes. I want you to get the ring. This son of mine has come back home. We need to celebrate it. Can you imagine what everybody around must have been thinking? This man didn't look like a son. This man did not deserve to be treated like that. He should have been told, go back where you came from. You've ruined your life. You smell like the pigs. Go live with them. But that's not what grace does. Grace was what made him a son in the first place. Grace was what kept him a son even in the pig pen. And grace was the very thing that when he came to his senses, lifted him back up. Grace. I don't think that son ever understood it. I know I wouldn't. I don't think he ever really understood that ring that was put on his dirty finger was grace upon grace. I don't think he ever understood that when that robe was put on his dirty back, that was grace upon grace. When he tasted that fatted calf, I don't think he understood why the Father was doing it. Aren't you glad you don't have to understand grace? Because I don't think any of us ever will. But thanks be to God that grace is enough to save every sinner. Grace is enough to keep every sinner that was saved, saved. And grace is enough to lift up everyone who has fallen. But not only that, grace is enough to help you bear any burden you may have. There's an interesting passage in 2 Corinthians. Paul begins to talk about, he calls it a messenger of Satan. He says to keep him from being conceited, that he was allowed to experience he uses the phrase thorn in his flesh. We don't know what it was, but it was something that aggravated him. Something that bothered him. Something he struggled with. Some people say that when he met Jesus on the Damascus Road, that bright light kind of messed up his eyes and he never totally regained his sight. There's some evidence from that in the book of Galatians, because he says that he actually wrote the book of Galatians. He didn't just dictate it. And he says, see what large letters I've written with my own hand. Some people say that Paul stuttered. He does make a couple of statements in the books of Corinthians about when he came, that his message was not flawless, in other words, that, his delivery wasn't good. We think Paul to be a great speaker. He probably wasn't. Some people say it was his appearance. Somebody said that he probably was a frail, little, tiny man who was sickly. We don't know what his thorn in the flesh was, but he prayed that God would take it away. Whatever it was that was bothering him, that he was struggling with, he prayed that God would deal with it. What did God say? I'm not going to take it away from you, but you will find that my grace is sufficient. I don't know what it is. I think every one of us have a thorn in the flesh. Every one of us have something we have to deal with. Maybe it's rheumatoid arthritis, and you just wonder every day how you're going to be able to get out of bed. And you know as soon as one foot hits the floor, you're going to be in pain. And maybe every day you have to pray, God, give me grace to make it through this day. Maybe there's an addiction in your life and you are trying your best to overcome it. And it's not getting easier. And every day you have to pray, God, give me the grace to make it through today because I can't do it. Maybe it's some other physical problem and you feel like you're discouraged and you don't know how you're going to make it and you just wonder how in the world you're going to face the future. And you have prayed that God would solve your problem. And God hasn't. And you have prayed that God would just take care of it. And God hasn't. But you know what God will do? God will give you the grace to bear it. And I don't know exactly how God does that. I don't know exactly. I can't explain to you the feeling. I can't explain to you how God does it. But I sure have gotten to see it on the face of believers who were struggling with things, yet they did not let it overcome them. It's just amazing to look into the eyes of someone in pain all the time who did not allow that to make them bitter. It's amazing to look into the eyes of a saint who loves to read their Bible, yet their eyes just keep getting worse and worse, and now they can't even read God's book. And yet they still hold on to the truth that's buried in their heart. It's amazing when a saint who loved to make pies and cakes for others and cook for others can't do it anymore, realizes that there is something they can do for God. What's it called? Grace. I don't understand it, but thanks be to God for it. Grace will save every sinner. It's enough to save you. It's enough to keep you saved. It is enough to lift you up when you are fallen. And it is enough to give you the strength to bear any burden you have to bear. It's also enough. It's enough to help you do any work that God's called you to do. Let's face it, being a Christian's tough. Because God gives us a standard that others don't have to live by. God says when someone strikes you on your right cheek, you don't get to smack them back. You turn to your other cheek. Jesus says when somebody abuses you and falsely accuses you, you have to forgive. Jesus says you have to let go of that grudge. And how many times have every one of us, said maybe out loud, and if we didn't say it out loud, we've said to ourselves, I can't do it. I can't do it. But you've heard me say enough times behind this pulpit, God will never call you to do something that God doesn't equip you to do. How can you forgive someone who has done something to you? How can you let go of that grudge? How can you turn the other cheek? Grace. How does God give us that ability? I can't explain it. But I have witnessed it in my own life, and many of you have too. You know that when push comes to shove, God will give you this feeling. God will give you the power, and maybe you can't explain it. But God will just whisper in your ear, let it go. And grace is enough to help you do any work God has ever called you to do. Grace is enough to save every sinner. Grace is enough to keep every sinner saved. Grace is enough to lift up the one who has fallen. Grace is enough to help you face that burden that you're having to bear. Grace is enough to help you do the work that God has called you to do. And lastly, grace is enough to see that you get home safely. It's amazing to be with a saint when their final days on this earth have come. And you look into the eyes of someone who has trusted Jesus Christ. Someone who knows that their final days are approaching, are there. That they're not going to make it much longer. To look in those eyes and to see that there is no fear there. To look into those eyes and realize that this person is facing the unknown with assurance in their heart. That this person is not scared. That this person is actually looking forward to this transition. And you see a peace. And you see the presence of God. And you realize that God's grace, the same grace that saved them, the same grace that kept them saved, the same grace that lifted them when they had fallen, the same grace that helped them bear that burden, the same grace that enabled them to do what God had called them to do, that same grace was going to see that they could get home safely. No wonder when John Newton was thinking about grace, there was one word that came to his mind. Amazing. Amazing. I wish I could explain it. I wish I could tell you how it happens, but I can't. All I know is when you need it, it'll be there. And as Paul is talking to the Corinthians, as he's looking back at everything he's done, I don't think he understood it. I don't think he could explain it, but I do think he realized that every time he needed it was there. Every time Paul needed the grace of God, it was there. It was never early, but it was never late either. And the same grace is available to you and to me. And it's still just as amazing today as it was back then.